As we saw, if one supplier, for whatever reason, did not have supply, of a piece of equipment or packaging or what have you, you would be able to go. And so a lot of diversification of the supply chain are big changes that are going on.
Welcome to Getting It Done. Today you'll meet Rob Mackie, an accomplished strategic leader in the food and beverage industry. Hi, welcome to the podcast. I've got a guest here, Rob. If you could give us a quick introduction.
Sure. Thank you, Ivan. I'm Rob Mackie, and after almost 30 years with the American Bakers Association, which was the national association representing the wholesale baking industry, I retired at the end of 2022. And in that role as president of the American Bakers Association, really was the chief advocate for the entire baking supply chain. So basically from the farm all the way to the consumer's table, we represented companies in every step of that supply chain. Got very involved in a lot of, and I mean advocacy in the broadest sense of the term, not just working with federal legislators, state legislators, and regulatory bodies, but also promoting the industry, both within kind of the food ecosystem, but also to other stakeholders. And it was just an incredible joy. The people are absolutely amazing. They're the most noble people, hardworking people you'll ever want to meet. And so, what really started is just, probably anticipated to be a shorter journey, ended up being a full career for all intents and purposes. I had the great honor of serving as president of the association for 17 years. And again, just got to meet and interact with some incredible leaders in the food industry, and certainly in the baking industry. And again, I learned as much as I hopefully shared in that perspective. But again, I mean that total honor and a privilege to serve that industry, and to sort of protect the industry from a lot of government overreach, but also hopefully created some opportunities over the years. So again, now I'm doing some consulting work with a couple of clients, including Kansas State University, on their new Global Center for Grain and Food Innovation, which I'm extremely excited about. And we can talk about that another time too. So
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the baking industry is actually something, we all benefit from, but probably pay very little attention to, as most consumers. We just expect it to arrive, every day, fresh, safe, and in abundance and affordable. And the reality is to achieve that, there must be an incredible system that happens, that works exceptionally well, that fits within sort of government oversight, and everyone has to make a profit and everyone has to be able to do their job. And, we casually just go pick up, a loaf or pick up something interesting to eat. And, it's so, taken for granted. So there must be a lot of challenges within that space, around food security, around being able to produce, effectively and at a profit, and still sort of behave within the government's requirements.
Yeah, I can tell you frequently, Ivan, at family celebrations, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, you gather with the family and everybody would ask, so what could the baking industry possibly need? An office in Washington, an advocate, with government? And the short answer is that baking and frankly the food industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the entire country. It's regulated by what goes into the product, how you get the product to the market, to the consumer, how you advertise and communicate to the consumer. And by the way, all of your leftover waste, whether it's water from the process, whether it's packaging, all of that is heavily regulated. And so you need to be both a generalist and a specialist in terms of advocating for the industry. And, then you get into things like food safety and a whole host of issues, workforce issues. It's one of the largest workforces in manufacturing, believe it or not. Manufacturing is food and beverage manufacturing is the largest manufacturing sector in the United States. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't realize that. And the value of those exports is the number one export by even exceeding commodity agriculture to the United States. So food, beverage manufacturing is critically important to our economy. We have, just in the baking sector alone, almost 1 million people working in the supply chain, whether it's from an ingredient supplier, equipment, packaging, or the bakers themselves. And it's an amazing industry. These people, were so talented and so dedicated to producing that product in a value added way to the consumers. And we saw that in spades during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
We tend to put some painful memories out into the back of our mind, but was talking to somebody recently, and we were recalling, when people thought that there was no flour left because there were flour shortages, at grocery stores, and because people were getting into baking, they were getting into home baking. And it was fascinating to me is there was no shortage of flour. What there was a shortage of was the small bags that go to the consumer. And I would joke, I did a number of press interviews, and I said, you could go to Amazon right now and buy a 50-pound bag of flour and have it delivered to your home. Now, that's probably a little more than people needed. But again, what it did is it just highlighted something that people just take for granted, both from availability as well as the nutritional value of those products. People all of a sudden, I think, really realized how important baking is to just nourishing, sustaining life on the planet. And what I love about the industry is it doesn't matter where in the world you go, there is a ubiquitous baking product in that part of the country that is life sustaining. And I've often said, and there's no greater purpose in the world than feeding our communities and our countries, and the baking industry is at the base of that effort.
Absolutely. It reminds me of two strange things. One is, I remember, I think I was touring somewhere in Switzerland about the underground bunkers, in the days of the Cold War and fear of, atomic fallout. And it was a list of important people to have in the bunker. And number one on the list was Baker. He was the most important person to be put into the bunker, he or she. And that highlights what you're saying. And then the second is a very good friend of mine ordered one of those massive bags of flour and started distributing it because that's all you could order were these big bags. And everyone started baking, and there was, it was just like a really good, cake and cookie time. And, it's interesting. And then what's interesting is the cause of it, because I didn't realize that. So the cause of it was the bags. And I suppose that's the key thing about supply chains at the moment. Is the pandemic has highlighted where the supply chains are a little fragile or weak, and a lot of things we took for granted we shouldn't take for granted. And so I was just thinking, if you're a smaller manufacturer, this is quite a daunting thing. This whole process must be quite a daunting thing. And then if you add on top of it the whole sort of regulatory side of the business, it's also got to be, so I'm just trying to think, if I want to start off in this field, it seems very challenging. Do you have anything to say around that? Yeah.
No, I think, wow, there's a lot to unpack there, Ivan. I could go to, I think, so impressed with the food industry and bakers specifically, but really the entire food industry and the supply chain. Because if you think about pre-pandemic, think about March 1st, 2020, here in the United States, 52% of meals were consumed outside of the home. And that has a very distinct supply and distribution channel versus the 48% that is consumed in home, which one gets at the grocery store typically, or however they get it, but it's through a retail channel. And so overnight, literally within a week, that 52% almost went away. It went down to 3 or 4% of meals right away. And so the industry had to adapt to change from one supply chain channel to the retail channel. And there were disruptions. That there wasn't an availability issue. It was getting that product, and particularly for fresh, short shelf life product, perishables, there was some real challenges. But again, the industry rallied together, got through it. I think what you're seeing is now sort of the back end is, the global supply chain, and people don't realize that, even in like a loaf of bread, or some of these ubiquitous products, how global that supply chain is. And so we are, we certainly started to see some of those challenges, midway through the pandemic, because you can't run in a crisis mode, for only so long. But then we got into a lot of conversations with regulatory agencies, particularly the Food and Drug Administration, for flexibility. So for instance, you have certain types of labels for food service channel product versus certain types of labels for retail channel. And when we were moving product from one channel to the other, we needed a waiver from the Food and Drug Administration to allow us to put those types of products on the shelf, on a moment's notice. And then there was also some of the supply chain availability on certain ingredients. I mean, for a while, there were some ingredients that were solely sourced out of India that was completely shut down, and similarly China. And we're still seeing the net impacts of supply chains out of China. Now they're coming back, and I expect that will be, better. But what that's caused is a rethinking of the whole, of just sort of the whole supply chain mentality, going from a just in time, and I like to think the food industry is the ultimate just in time. You would get a load of flour, and within 48 hours that was on the grocery store shelves or in a restaurant as a product, and similarly with other perishable products. But so now it's a little bit more just in case, and so you're going to have things on supply, and that includes spare parts for the equipment. It includes packaging, and it includes some ingredients that you can't that you just have to make a product. And so that's still evolving, and I think there's going to be an equilibrium. I do think we're seeing a lot of sort of resourcing of key ingredients, or finding alternatives to key ingredients.
So is that where it's going? Is that is that the future of this industry? Is the rethinking the supply chain, rethinking the inventory levels? I mean, when you talk about spares for your plant equipment, that's something I didn't consider. I'm just thinking of the raw ingredients as being the key bits. But obviously, if something is faulty and you need to have it repaired, you have that same supply chain issue if you cannot get that part because of whatever. Right. So it's a very wide gambit that is going to have to be considered in order to ensure sort of food security, and to ensure, and as a business owner, to ensure that you can keep producing. Because if you're not producing, you're not profitable.
Right. No, and I think we saw during the supply chain. I mean, there were some, if things were not resolved, we were a great example is was the potential for a rail strike here in the United States last year, and we're not a doom and gloom. The food industry is a get it done industry. We see a challenge, we find a way to overcome it, work around it, and what have you. But that would have been catastrophic in the sense that within probably 48 hours of that rail strike, certain sections of the country were not going to be able to get certain food, and particularly perishable food products, because of lack of ingredients, lack of packaging, all of those kinds of things. And so what that does is that's a wake-up call, to the industry. And so I think you are going to see, sort of having more inventory of spare parts, ingredients, packaging, and so on and so forth. And it'll be interesting to see how all of that settles out. Again, so going from a just-in-time to a just-in-case mentality. Not everything, and there's going to be certain things you can only source internationally. But I think there's a lot of conversations going on is where do we want to source those things from? So that, is there areas of political instability? Is there competitive pressures, between parts of the world? And I listened to, talk to the folks at Rabobank from their Insight Group, about what was going on in China and Asia. And it was a bit of a wake-up call, because if there are supply chain disruptions further out of China, and we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, with the ships off the port of LA and Long Beach, where product wasn't getting offloaded. But if it was a more deliberate effort, if you will, to withhold certain ingredients, certain equipment pieces, what would that do to the world supply chain? And so I think innovative leaders in the food industry, all up and down the supply chain, are working through those just in case. And I think the other big change is it used to be a lot of single source. You would buy in bulk,
Yes, yes.
and now you're going to multiple
Mm,
suppliers because as we saw, if one supplier for whatever reason did not have supply
mm.
of a piece of equipment or packaging or what have you, you would be able to go. And so a lot of diversification of the supply chain are big changes that are going on.
Which is diversification of your risk, in effect.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
in effect what is happening. I have heard a lot of talk about nearshoring and ally shoring, sort of as a counter to a lot of those points.
Right.
And I suppose, so if I'm a sort of small or medium-sized manufacturer, it's quite, normally it would be quite straightforward. You'd find the best product at the best price. Single
Yes.
point of sale makes it easier. You're paying one bill. It's one, communication channel. Now you're starting to have to think about these other elements to the process, and basically it adds a layer of complexity, I guess, in their world. But on the other hand, it also adds a high degree of safety to ensure that their business continuously operates.
Yes.
Um, but it will be, as most things are, there's always a challenge.
Yes.
It's every new day has something
Yes.
new and interesting that is coming.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, Ivan, because I had a a great conversation with a board member, an AVA board member last year, and we were it was some new issue. I don't know if it was access to wooden pallets. I mean, it was just things that you just don't think about
Hmm.
on a daily basis. And, we were having this sort of a little bit of woe is me type conversation. And then they said to me, in a moment of clarity, they said to me, Rob, how long have you been with ABA? And I said, almost 30 years. And I said, tell me one day that we didn't have a challenge. There was some
Exactly.
disruption, and I'm like, you're right. It's just the nature of the food business,
Yes.
And so, and that's why I'm so impressed with the way the industry is able to, in some cases work together. And to your point about smaller companies, smaller and medium-sized companies that may not have the resources or the global reach, in their supply chains, the relationships, the ecosystems that are built around the industry that even smaller and medium-sized companies can tap into is enormously valuable.
Yes.
I don't think many of them would survive, and the food industry has always been a very close relationship industry, and unlike others that I'm familiar with. And so leaning on those relationships, leaning on those ecosystems has helped those companies get through. And part of that's working with their trade associations, but a lot of it is just, the one-on-one connections and getting to know, a broader, and that includes up to the retailer or to the food service company as well, because if you have to adapt on the fly, and I think it's been said that the pandemic has been an accelerator of trends, and I wholeheartedly subscribe to that. So a lot of the trends that we're moving along, pre-pandemic have now all accelerated, I think, throughout the pandemic, and then sort of, is it safe to say the back end of the pandemic? Because I think we're now in a more endemic state.
Oh, yeah.
But a lot of lessons learned, but that pace of transition has been enormous. But
It has.
yeah,
Dan Veroni, I think we a mutual colleague, and
yes,
he coined a phrase called co-opetition. Co-opetition, I think
yes,
it was.
yes,
And we've
exactly.
seen a lot more of that. And that I think, as a small and medium-sized manufacturer, you both play a significant role in the industry,
Yes,
but you have access to a lot of peers and other similar companies, and larger or smaller, that can benefit from collaboration, um, which has been very, very prevalent and very beneficial in the pandemic,
right.
because, as a small manufacturer, you cannot talk to government, for example, and, they might be making massive decisions on your behalf, and you need the voice. So that was
Yes,
very interesting around the trade association. And then if you're talking about diversifying supply chain, what a better way than to talk to your peers, to
yes,
understand. You sort of compete on one level, but you
Right.
can also cooperate on another level because it makes sense,
Yes.
because
And
everyone's
there,
in it together. So,
yeah. And I think you're
yeah.
seeing, Ivan, you're seeing more of that. Now, obviously, here in the United States, we have very strict antitrust laws. And so we
Hmm.
have to be
Hmm.
very careful on what you talk about. But I mean, the thing that I'm so proud of the industry, speaking generally, the food industry, is there are what we refer to as pre-competitive issues, and food safety is number one.
Hmm.
And so
Absolutely.
the amount of sharing, because nobody wants a customer getting sick.
Hmm.
Nobody wants to go through just the horrific process of doing a recall, um, and let alone the economic. There's a moral imperative. Nobody wants to get their customers sick or any of those types of things or worse. And so the information sharing around food safety techniques and
Abs-
practices, best practices is huge. And I think there are other areas that you can leverage that. And so what are some of the innovative things that you can talk about, whether it's innovations in manufacturing,
mhm, mhm.
innovations in supply chain management, risk management, and things like that. As long as you don't get into the things that are sort of prohibited by antitrust law, you're okay.
Mhm.
And I think these things go in a pendulum. I think you saw a
Yes.
lot of collaboration during the 70s, and think about the wheat crisis and some of the things going on
Mm.
in the world. And then we got into the 80s and certainly the 90s, and there was a lot more attention and attempt to to differentiate, if you will. And so you didn't see quite as much of that collaboration. It feels like here on the back end of the pandemic, you're seeing more of that. And again, these are fierce competitors. And I think that's where the
Mm.
trade associations come in. That is the safe space where that
Yes.
information sharing can happen. And every trade association worth its salt will make sure that you don't cross the antitrust
Yes,
lines.
absolutely. So that they almost become arbitrator of sort of, hey,
Yes.
stop, that's not something we should be discussing.
Right.
But on the other hand, here are great things we can discuss and work together as
Yes.
an industry to where everyone benefits, and it's not
Yes.
benefiting in a way that is breaking any rules.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question? I was, as I mentioned before we started recording, on my travels around, I noticed
Yes.
quite a lot of artisanal bakeries popping up,
Yes.
and
There's a lot of energy there, Ivan,
yeah,
in that space, and even the artisanal wholesale bakers, the growth there has been
okay.
phenomenal. And I think you picked up on something that's very much, again, talking about trends. That was sort of on trend before the pandemic, and then it has certainly accelerated
Mhm.
through the pandemic, and then also here in this where we are today.
Yeah, I sort of I'm enjoying that trend because it was
Yeah.
interesting to talk to the people because you felt like you had a connection. Somehow you got
Yeah.
connected to the food that they were creating because it was
Yes.
sort of a smaller industry. But of course, they have the same challenges. They need
Yes.
to source supply, they need food safety, food security, they have to comply, they need to be fresh. They need to have packaging. All the same. They have the
Yeah.
same challenges, just on a much, much smaller scale. But I
Yes.
did find it interesting that there was so much of that happening. Um,
And I think and I think global consumers too.
mm,
They're demanding more transparency about where their
mm,
food comes from, what's
mm,
in their food,
mm,
and I think the food industry is responding to that at multiple levels. And I think it's probably in some ways easier for maybe a regional artisan food company to say, oh, well, I'm getting this ingredient from that farm, within 100 miles. I'm
mm,
getting this
mm.
ingredient, and it's so much easier to sort of be transparent. But I think even the large, multi-billion-dollar companies, are doing the same thing. When I talk
Mm,
to them, they want to not only do they want to know more about where they're sourcing,
mhm,
their ingredients or packaging and equipment from, but also where more about it and be a partner,
mhm,
and help. So whether it's, working with a farmer so that they're much more economically viable and they
mm,
understand the consumer pressures, I think a
mm,
lot of work needs to happen there. I've been reading this incredible book by Ray Starling, who used to work for this Secretary of Agriculture, and in very sort of plain language, he talks about this dichotomy between the food industry, including production agriculture, and so-called influencers. and there's a huge disconnect, you know, and so there's a lot of work I think that needs to happen there, and that would be a great conversation to unpack, you know, when we have more time, because I think he makes some really good recommendations in terms of the industry needs to really connect the dots with, you know, with their consumers, their core consumers, and so they understand, you know, again, the basics. Where's their food coming from? How is it made? What's in it? And so, and they shouldn't be shy. They should be very proud of the products that they make, because they're certainly in the United States, they're feeding their communities at the lowest possible cost. The margins in the food business, as you know, are very, very thin, and I know it unfairly gets, you know, criticized by some in the media, and even some, you know, with government officials, because of the ongoing food inflation. But there's reasons for that, and part of it is supply chain, part of it's workforce.
Well, I mean,
part of it's regulation. Let's just be honest.
Absolutely. I mean, the cost of regulation, cost of labor has gone up tremendously, and then associated cost of everything will go up due to cost of labor going up, and any additional regulation makes everything in effect more expensive, because if there's more things to comply with, or I mean, if you, and tracking food, you know, if you need to track, you know, everything from source, it logistically, you know, or administratively, it is tricky. It's a tricky process.
No, I had a retailer share with me. They track, and more companies should do this in the food industry. They track what they call margin squeeze. So what is the cost of regulation when you add it all together? What is the cost of government? Because that margin squeeze means if, and in their case, they were about 3.5% squeeze on their margin.
Wow.
Which is not insignificant. And I'm not comfortable sharing the name of the company because it was shared with me in confidence. But what that means is less to invest in new product development, less to invest in other important areas. And this is a company that is I would say one of the top 5 companies in the country known for customer service. You know, they do everything they can to bend over backwards to serve the customer. That walks into their grocery stores. And, you know, the fact that they're tracking it was just eye-opening to me. But the fact that they quantified it down, you know, to such a precision level. And again, nobody is saying that there shouldn't be food safety regulations. Nobody is saying there shouldn't be environmental regulations or workforce regulations. But boy, it seems to me that in this era, we ought to be able to do that a lot smarter. We've got all these tools. You talk about technology tools, traceability. There's ways to do it. And what worries me is while during, you know, the pandemic and the early part of the supply chain crisis, you know, you had some government officials that understood that, and they were willing to be flexible. And unfortunately, now you've got folks that have said, well, we're going back to the way we used to do business. Well, have we not learned anything?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, that we could actually, you know, produce a low cost product in the safest possible way, you know, with minimum environmental impact? Apparently not. So government needs to adapt as much as anybody else.
Absolutely, and that could be another whole conversation on its own, because you don't get me started on that particular side of things, because you know, lately all I feel like is I'm a compliance form filler inner, if there's such a role, you know, endlessly uploading proof of this and proof of that, and then you know, I want to know, like, what are you doing with it? If I'm, you know, are you just ticking a box, or is it actually being used to provide some value somewhere in the process? Or are you basically just covering, you know, protecting yourself from some future thing? And it is one of my, which is maybe we'll save for another day, because
so let me paint a mental picture for you, Ivan. I'm sure you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that last scene where they put the Ark into a government warehouse, never to be seen again. All of your compliance are going into the digital version of that.
Exactly.
Never to be seen again.
Never to be seen again. Unless it's that one day and they're like, oh, hold on. Yeah. He said this on this form. Let's quickly find it. And, oh, man.
Until they need it for enforcement purposes. Then they'll find that form. Right.
Then they'll find that form. No, it is an interesting time when it comes to government regulation, and what I'm enjoying with trade associations, which I wasn't completely familiar with prior to embarking on this exercise, was is actually is probably where you guys can offer which you do offer a tremendous amount of value, is just
Yes.
a little pushback. So it's not just
Yes.
completely a bureaucrat on one side who's just getting everything he's asking for delivered. It's
Yes.
somebody on the other side saying, hold on, do you understand? This is 3.5% margin we're giving away, or additional cost we're
Yes.
adding, or or these are the implications of what you're asking for, and we need that. And
Yes.
it's because you need that balance between the capitalist, the manufacturer, the business owner, and then of course the government and regulations. They both have their role, but you need a healthy, it
Yes.
needs to be balanced. It cannot be one-sided, otherwise it just
No,
doesn't work.
that's a
Yeah,
great point. And
yeah,
I think, I always refer to the association community as the force multiplier.
yeah.
So that,
Nice way.
when you collectively bring the industry together, and again, being very respectful of antitrust issues, they can be a force multiplier to either block something that has no value, or would be incredibly detrimental, or more ideally, be a partner with government and say, oh, understand what the goal is. And I think food safety is a good example of this. But where you can come forward and say, understand what the goal is. Here's another way, building on the expertise and the success over the years of industry collectively. Here's another way to accomplish the goal that's not going to have as great of an impact
Yeah.
on the industry. It's always, though, it's the thing that always gets me is things get surprised, with no consultation with stakeholders. And it gets sort of thrown out there, and people think it's a good idea in a vacuum, with no consultation with stakeholders. And I'm not under the illusion that government's going to take everything that industry says, at face value. They have a role and responsibility, but
absolutely.
they ought to give us a little bit of benefit of the doubt. And
Absolutely.
we're in it every day.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. I mean, the scope of unintended consequences is massive,
oh my
when it
goodness,
comes to
yes,
these things. Yeah.
yes. But I think the other thing, Ivan, I wanted to spend a little bit of time today is because we've talked a lot about on the cost side is, what is the food industry doing in terms of taking costs out of the system, given the inflationary pressures with, input costs, with workforce and things like that. And, I think what's really happening is it's just a big push for automation, and different than it was 20 years ago from the perspective of, it used to be automation was just to take headcount down. If we can reduce our workforce, by 20%, 25%, that's savings to the bottom line, and then there would be ROI models based on, if you put in a new automated line, in the manufacturing process. That has changed because of the severe workforce shortages, in not only the United States, but around the world, certainly in Europe and other places. And so that ROI model has changed. And so companies, particularly innovative companies, are looking at their entire manufacturing process and they're going, okay, what is the low value activity and what's the high value activity? And if we can automate the low value activity and, maybe putting packages of product in a cardboard box or into a plastic tray or shelf or something like that, if you could automate that out, again, in a safe way that protects the product, you can now retrain those folks into a higher value activity, which is going to be more, keeping these high speed pieces of equipment running, doing maintenance, sanitation, things. And so at the end, you're doing a lot of retraining and you're seeing, food companies are investing in that training like never before, whether it's their own proprietary training or whether it's an outside resource like an association or online training capability. And so if you can, your head count is shrinking, but what you're doing is you're in a time when you may have, 20, 30% turnover. If you can retrain and invest in those employees, those key associates, future, and I've seen it happen with folks that may have been with a company for 20 or 30 years, the knowing that they're getting reinvested, the company is supporting their growth and development, for the long term is enormously invigorating. And so it allows them, and then by the way, most of those positions come with higher compensation across the board.
Absolutely. Yes, because you're actually adding higher value
Yeah.
and therefore you get
Right.
rewarded because you're adding higher value.
And that whole ROI model for the company has now changed too. Because if you're not having to go out and hire and replace people, and reducing your turnover, even if you could, just start to chip away at your turnover rate. And then also, by the way, you've got folks that are already invested in your company's culture, and now you're creating even more fulfillment and purpose within your own company. And so I think you're already seeing a lot of that. I was with a company last week that's in the automation space, and they're trying to do everything they can to reduce friction points, from a workforce perspective, and including sanitation, so that they're redesigning equipment that makes it easier to clean, easier to be, food safe, if you will. And all of that is going to have an enormous benefit down the road. And by the way, it takes costs out of the system.
Absolutely.
So ultimately that benefits the consumer.
Yes, which is good. It's pretty much an area that we focus a lot on, not on an equipment side of thing, but on business processes, especially with external parties. So, how you talk to your supplier base, how your customer talks to you, what can you automate? And so instead of somebody just being manually recapturing information from an email into a different system, or capturing from one system to the other, automating those things. So exactly that low value to high value. And I love how you put that. We as humans, we prefer to be adding higher value. It's more engaging as opposed to doing rote work, that becomes mind numbing. And when it's mind numbing, you make mistakes because you're bored, basically. So, taking people and making them, conscious, more valuable, it's an excellent strategy.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think, Rob, we're already a few minutes in. So it's been a very interesting chat. Before we sign off, is there anything you want to, if people want to get hold of you, how could they reach you? And we'll put some information in the description of the podcast, but feel free to share any information you wish.
Ivan, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I want to hear more about your trip through the center of our country, because I could use some advice, with places to go that I haven't seen yet. But no, really, and I think you're providing an important service in terms of just getting information out there. So it's been a pleasure. Would be happy to follow up with anybody that wants to learn more. You can reach me at Rob at 4T, FORTI, globalstrategies.com. That's the name of my new company, 4T Global Strategies. There's a whole story behind that, which I won't go into now. But and happy to help out. I'm doing some work with the food industry, and providing some insights and some strategy positioning, in addition to my work with Kansas State University for the Global Center for Innovation.
Which sounds incredibly exciting.
It is not only is it exciting, Ivan, it is so overdue and so needed in the food industry right now in terms of not only talent development, but research. And it's a multidisciplinary approach that I think is spot on, which includes not just, the degreed programs from milling, baking, food, feed and pet food, but also engineering, manufacturing processes, as well as business leadership, because these are the folks that will be the business leaders of the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rob. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.